In the summer of 1928, this man was richer than most countries on Earth. The newspapers called him the Belgian Richest. By most estimates, he was the third richest human being alive. And on the evening of July the 4th, he climbed aboard his private plane in England, bound for Brussels. Somewhere over the English Channel, 4,000 feet up, he stood and walked to the small lavatory at the back of the cabin. He never came back. When his staff finally went to check, the door was open and the cabin was empty. One of the richest men on the planet had vanished into thin air. There were 6 other people on that aircraft. Every one of them told the same story, and almost none of it made sense. This is the billion-dollar myth of the man who fell from the sky. Alfred Loewenstein was born in Brussels in 1877, the son of a banker. He had a gift the rest of his family didn't: a feral instinct for money and absolutely no fear of risk. In the 1920s, he saw the future before almost anyone. The future was electricity. He bought up power companies across Europe and Latin America, wiring entire nations and collecting the bill from millions of people at once. He moved into artificial silk, into finance, into deals so large they crossed borders like weather. At his peak, his personal fortune was estimated at well over $100 million, billions in today's money. And he wanted everyone to know it. He kept racehorses, private planes, a personal staff that traveled with him everywhere. His Fokker tree motor was a flying office. He conducted million-dollar deals at altitude while ordinary men were still taking the train. But under the glamour, there was a problem. And it's the key to everything that happened next. Behind the headlines, Loewenstein's empire was stretched dangerously thin. He had built his fortune the way a magician builds an illusion, with borrowed money, layered companies, and confidence. He controlled a web of holding companies that owned pieces of each other, propped up by shares that had to keep rising. And quietly, by the summer of 1928, those shares had started to wobble. Powerful people were betting against him. He had made enemies, rival financiers, short sellers who would make a fortune the moment Loewenstein faltered. He was planning one last enormous deal, a $50 million company that would either save him or finish him. He never closed it. On July 4th, 1928, he ran out of time. That evening, Loewenstein arrived at Croydon Aerodrome outside London to fly home to Brussels. His plane was waiting, and so was his crew. Remember them. There were 6, a pilot, a mechanic, his personal valet, his male secretary, and 2 young stenographers who typed his letters as he dictated them in the air. The cabin was small, a single narrow aisle, a row of wicker seats, and, at the very back, 2 doors side by side. One opened into a tiny lavatory. The other opened into nothing but 5,000 feet of open air. They looked almost exactly alike. The plane took off, crossed the coast, and headed out over the channel into the dusk. For a while, everything was normal. Loewenstein read his papers. Then, the accounts say, he stood up. He walked to the back of the cabin, toward those 2 identical doors. And that is the last anyone admits to seeing him alive. 10 minutes passed, maybe more. The richest passenger on the plane did not come back. Finally, his valet, Fred Baxter, went to check on him. He reached the rear of the cabin and stopped. The lavatory was empty, and the outer door, the one that opened onto open sky, was unlatched, shuddering in the wind. Alfred Loewenstein was gone. Somewhere behind them, he had fallen into the sea. The pilot, shaken, brought the plane down on a beach near Dunkirk on the French coast. And there, on that beach, the 6 survivors began to tell their story. It would never change. And that, investigators later said, was exactly the problem. When the authorities questioned the crew, every account matched perfectly. Loewenstein got up. He went to the back. He must have, they said, opened the wrong door by mistake and been ripped out into the air. It was a tidy explanation, a careless rich man, a fatal mix-up, a tragic accident. But almost immediately, it started to fall apart. Because when engineers tested that door, they found something that didn't fit the story. At cruising speed, the rushing air pressed against that door with enormous force. A man couldn't simply nudge it open and stumble out. To get it open in flight, he would have had to fight it, bracing, shoving, with deliberate, sustained strength. This was not a careless bump in the dark, which left investigators with 3 possibilities. An accident that the physics rejected, suicide, or murder. Take suicide first. On paper, it had a motive. His empire was teetering. The shares that held it all up were sliding. Ruin was a real possibility. A proud man, facing the collapse of everything he'd built, might choose to step out of the world on his own terms. But there was a problem with that theory too. A man set on suicide does not usually need to wrestle for 10 minutes with a jammed door in front of a cabin full of witnesses. And the cabin was tiny. 4 of the 6 people on board were sitting only steps from that door. They claimed they noticed nothing, saw nothing, heard nothing. A man fighting a roaring door open against the wind, and not one of the 4 people beside him saw it happen. That strained belief to its limit. Which brings us to the question this channel always asks. Who profited? Because Loewenstein dead was worth a great deal to a great many people. The short sellers betting against his companies stood to make fortunes the instant the market learned he was gone. His tangled empire was a house of cards. Some of his own associates may have feared that if he closed his next giant deal, he'd drag them down with him. And every person who could have told the truth about that flight worked for him or was paid by the people around him. In the weeks after, investigators found the crew hard to pin down. They moved, they scattered, the inquiry went cold. The consistent story stayed consistent and unprovable. No one was ever charged. The official verdict was essentially a shrug. Death by misadventure. 2 weeks later, fishermen working the channel pulled a body from the water. It was Loewenstein. The injuries were consistent with a long fall. And the great question of how he came to fall was never answered. The death of the 3rd richest man in the world made headlines across the planet. And then the part the headlines almost missed. His empire began to crumble within months. The illusion he'd held up with sheer confidence couldn't survive without him. The companies were carved up, sold off, quietly dissolved. The vast fortune turned out to be far smaller and far more fragile than the world believed. That was the real billion-dollar myth. Not just that he vanished, but that the fortune he died for was, in large part, a story he told well enough that everyone believed it, including perhaps him. So what happened in that cabin? A clumsy accident the physics rejects, a suicide with no quiet moment to do it, or a push, in the dark, by someone who needed him gone. Nearly a century later, no one knows. The only 6 people who could tell us took the answer with them. A man who could buy almost anything in the world walked toward 2 identical doors. And behind one of them, his entire myth came apart. If you want to see how another impossible fortune fell apart, watch this one next. Because every empire that looks too big to fall already is.